Hello, everybody, and welcome to today's webinar talking about the top 10 barriers to practice growth and solutions. This is our first in the series for Firm of the Future. This is a bit of a recap of what's happened last year. We're now in January, and what you can do, prepare for yourself for the 2016 calendar year, and some of the thoughts and thinking that you might want to do in order to set yourself up for a fantastic year going forward. What is Firm of the Future? Well, if you were at QB Connect, or again, you've looked at some of the documentation of Firm of the Future, it's really broken into three different sections. There's moving to the cloud, there's becoming a trusted advisor, and there's ultimately getting connected. And as you look at content and you look at the webinars that are coming forward, they're going to fall on one of these three tracks. Today, we're really going to be talking about how to become a trusted advisor and some of the details surrounding that. My name is Ian Vason. I work for Carbon. Our web address is there, www.carbonhq.com. I'm the VP of Product Marketing. My email is up there as well, ian@carbonhq.com. I'm the Vice President of Product Marketing at Carbon. I've been there for about 9 months. The firm's been around for about a year and a half. I'm a co-founder as well. I have 20 years of accounting and high-tech experience. I spent 10 years of that, almost 10 years of that at Intuit, where I used to lead the Pro Advisor program. So some of you may have seen me before. There's a recent picture of me as well. If you don't know what Carbon is, again, you can go to our web address, but we're the place that you collaborate with your team and look after your clients. This is not a demo on Carbon. If you want to learn more, please go to that web address. Because what we're talking about today are the top 10 barriers to practice growth. I'm going to give you a little bit of background ultimately about how these came about and what we've learned, because a lot of what we've learned are from pro advisors out there across the United States, even Canada. We've met with a lot of different folks, and how we did that was on the Carbon side. We did it as a research activity to understand a little bit more of what the trends and what was happening, but it also became a great outlet and a great conversation piece for folks to really discuss, what's really getting, what's barring them from getting to the next level, what's holding them back, and ultimately, what were some of the solutions and some of the key tips and tricks about how to overcome those when facing them along the journey. We've done so far over 25 accounting roundtables. They'll range in size anywhere from 6. The largest we had was 30, but generally they're 10 to 12 people in size. We've hit a wide variety of the geography of the U.S. Again, we dabbled a little bit in Canada and Toronto, and obviously in the U.K. for a little bit. But the way that these roundtables were set up were, and this is an exercise you should be doing at this time of year as well, is to take a look at exactly what ultimately is inhibiting you from getting to where you want to go. Practice growth doesn't have to be defined as ultimately, getting more clients. It could be in terms of getting more revenue per client. It could be in terms of just how do I get more time back? How do I spend more time with my family? So it's how do you want to grow the practice ultimately to meet the goals that you want to get to? And so when we would do the roundtables, they generally are about 3 hours long. And we would spend quite a bit up front in terms of getting people to understand who each other, who each person in the room was, and then ultimately taking a step back and thinking through from a practice perspective, what ultimately is driving the practice forward and what's really, again, holding me back. And we used this particular set of questions. There was actually a lot more than these. I just summed up to what the top 5 were. But first, what keeps you up at night? And regarding your practice, what do you constantly worry about, and why do you worry about that? What are your goals for not just this year, but let's think about next year or the year out. What are those more long-term or medium-term goals versus just the client satisfaction goals and projects that you want to complete today? If you took it at a different perspective, if I was to double the size of my firm, let's say it was employee count, or let's say it was doubling the size of clients that I serve, what would I need to ultimately do that? What would be the key components that I would have to address? Where do you spend the big buckets of your time on those things that aren't driving, revenue generating activities? Where is that time being spent and why? And my personal favorite is, are your clients happy? How do you know? And if you do know, how are you meeting those, and what can you extrapolate that? And from those that aren't, ultimately, why are those clients not happy, and what is it that they're missing? What are the things that you wish you had at your fingertips in order to address? And so this is something, again, as we get into this new year, I think, it's one of those things you want to take some time back. I mean, this might be an evening where you sit back and you just pontificate on, well, okay, well, where do I really want to go? And what really is holding me back? And once you're able to get a sense of what those, and again, only go for 3, it's all you really need, and limit yourself. It's not something that's going to take you shouldn't take much time on this. When we do it as the exercise for the roundtables, people only have 3 minutes to be able to figure out what those are. And so I would also hold yourself to only a few minutes, because the things that are top of mind are probably the right things overall. A little bit more background is, when we worked with folks, we were looking at, how do you unlock practice growth? And there's really 2 sides of the equation, and everyone's really familiar with this. You've got the revenue side and the cost side. And what's interesting, when we talk to folks and when we went through this in detail, the revenue side takes a lot longer, because we've listed out here, if you want more clients, you just can't stick a sign outside your door and all of a sudden they just arrive. There's a lot more that happens with that. Charging higher fees. Generally a lot of people do that as a once-a-year activity. If you're doing value pricing or whatnot, you have a little more flexibility as clients come in. But again, it's something that you just can't do at a moment's notice. And then more revenue per client is actually one of the easier ones. And a lot of folks were having a lot of success on cross-sell and upsell from the clients that they had. And there were some interesting models on how to incentivize the organization as a whole in order to drive that. But again, the revenue side takes a little bit more energy and a little bit more time to put in place. Where people more gravitated towards in the short term was around the reduced cost. And that really came down to efficiency overall. One of those was, how do I get better processes? How do I, get economies of scale? But then there's things like, well, how do I lower my staff costs? What's the right staff for the right job? Or how do I lower my infrastructure costs? Why am I doing the ways I've always done it? Is there a different way I could do it? And how does technology play in that? And what's the best efficiency of my resources, not just staff, time, but also capital? And so again, when looking at it, these are where these different barriers and the solutions kind of brought together and were brought out in terms of how do you ultimately benefit. And when we did the roundtables, we put people in a thought exercise, and it helps to give you a perspective of how, when you look at these particular top 10, take into account the fact that it is from a broader pool, and understand some of the nuances of your business, because it can be eye-opening in terms of you have to think about how you operate and how you do it. And so the typical, if you ask somebody, how efficient they were, the standard equation is up here: efficiency equals realization times utilization. And so we set people out to think about that, and then go around the table and talk about how efficient they were. And you could do it from like 0 to 10, 10 to 20, 20 to 30, and so forth. And then we compared against the averages, both from industry-wide and from the roundtables themselves. And then we talked it through. And what's interesting is if you take the industry average, which is by the AICPA, it's roughly around 44%. If you take the average that we had at the roundtables, it was roughly between 60 to 65%. But what's interesting overall was the answers varied, and they varied widely. And the reason why they varied widely was you have to understand the firms that you're speaking with or you're looking at. Inside of a firm, and we're going to see this play out a little bit later, there's people who do the work, there's people who manage the work, and there's people who oversee, as a partner or an owner, the business as a whole. And the closer you are to doing the work, the more efficient you are. There's also seasonality. If you're working on tax work, again, it's towards it's obviously January, February, whenever you're listening to this, it's tax season. You're going to be heavily realized and utilized because your head's down and getting the tax work done. But if you're managing it, then you're moving further and further away from where the work's being done. And if you're owning as a partner in a firm, then you're doing a lot of business development, and so your efficiency drops. And so if you're in a small firm and it's just you, for instance, you wear all those hats. And so that's going to have an impact on how you're able to deliver. And if you compound that with maybe the customers that you serve, and the engagements and the projects you have, it starts to change the numbers. Likewise, if you're in a large firm, again, you have that stratification. And so just throwing out numbers like this doesn't really provide you a whole lot of color and detail. So always be careful with numbers being thrown out. But also, when thinking about these top 10 barriers and the solutions given, think about how it applies. And it may not be the exact answer, but figure out how you can take away from that ultimately the benefit and the knowledge that we were able to find on the road. And again, that leads us to top 10 practice barriers. Again, this is collected from the 25 plus roundtables. We met with over 300 accounting professional firms across the country. And so it's a pretty robust set. And again, it wasn't a survey. It was in the weeds, in the details as a group setting. And again, over a large sample. Now, I want to bring it all together first is, when people are describing the barriers, ultimately the language may change a bit. So we want to make sure we group them together. And so we were able to bring them down into 7 large buckets. And so they're listed here. And some of them have more, underlying drivers than others. For instance, time, which sits there at 12%, work-life balance and time management. There was only a few that people articulated, but again, they got quite a bit of votes, which was why it's ultimately at 12%. But there wasn't a whole lot of individual barriers described. They were usually bucketed into those broader buckets. More so when you look at HR and practice management, there was a lot more articulation around that. And so again, you can look at the pie chart. We're going to see a little bit later after we get through all of the barriers. But it's an interesting thing to see that HR and it's number 1 tied to practice management. You ultimately have strategy as number 3, time, then client acquisition management, processes and tools, and sales and marketing as the last one in here. And again, we're going to go through the details though to give you a lot of color. So again, we don't have a whole lot of time. This webinar is a little bit less than an hour. So we're going to go through, the top 10, it's point by point, but I'm also going to give you the 3 main solutions or a couple of the main topics that were talked through about how people addressed each one of those barriers. So I'll give you the context and I'll give you some solutions and then we'll tie it up in a nice little bow at the end. So coming in at number 10 is acquiring new clients and expansion. And what that really meant was where people were coming from was, I want to be able to add new business. It wasn't just about the marketing. It's understanding, where do I find these people? Who are the right, who might be the right fit? And how do I be able to attract them to ultimately make up for maybe some of the clients that I've had to let go or have left, or to be able to sustain the growth trajectory that I want to go on. And so I put up the top 3 things here on the right, and some of these points are actually going to come into some other underlying top 10. So we're going to spend a little more time on this. My first suggestion here, and what's come up over and over again, is while the industry's changed, technologies and changed, it still is a referral marketing market in terms of your best clients come as referrals. Your best focus is on generating and pulling forward those referrals. And so if you had one place in terms of your focus on a sales and marketing effort, it should be strictly on that referral marketing. There's definitely more to do, and we'll see a little bit later, but referrals. And what that means is, and it came up time and time again, the best way to get referrals is to first focus on your client service. I know that's kind of cliche, we say it all the time, but again, clients who are happy, who are promoting, who are wowed by what you're able to deliver, and you can deliver that, are going to be the ones who are going to be able to speak up, approach others, and take that next step to ultimately get you in front of more people. Now, where the success came from is to be in the moment of closing work, getting that moment of satisfaction when you're delivering a project, a quarterly review, a year-end activity where you've been able to deliver the work that you've promised that you were going to deliver and you've delivered it well. That is when you should be having that conversation with your client to ultimately drive them to give you those referrals. Just putting it on the bottom of a newsletter or an email is not going to drive that behavior. It's got to be in the moment, and you got to actually be push for it with your clients directly. With that being said, you want to make it easy for those people who are going to refer you. And so if you're in a conversation with a client, it's going well, you ask for that referral, you need to follow up with an email that says, thank you very much, I'd love to have that referral. Could you give me a referral at this particular property? And again, there's Google My Business, so the Google reviews, there's Yelp, there's different places you can go to drive those reviews, and you want to have a mixture across. I would say, though, that the first place I would start would be the Google reviews. That's an offshoot of Google My Business. If you don't believe me, go into a web browser, type accountants or bookkeepers, whatever it might be that you're describing yourself, say accountants in San Francisco, that's where I'm based out of, and see what comes up. And you'll notice that the first thing that it presents are the local directory options in that local market. And then below that will be Yelp and the other referring platforms. So again, you want to make it easy for folks, and you want to make sure you're tackling the highest value there, but you do want to have a mixture. The other thing is you want to be able to thank the person who's given you a review. You want to be able to re-emphasize and be able to hopefully spur on more reviews from folks. So make sure you go and give a thank you, maybe give a gift card, whatever it might be, in order to return the favor. So that's a bit on the referral side. Don't be, in terms of if you have a review and you get a bad review, you just want to address it. You want to be able to deal with it. But bad reviews ultimately will happen, and it ultimately gives a realism to the actual rating and reviews process. So it's, in some cases, it's a good thing. On the second point, know your customer. And this is going to come up over and over again. You need to identify, and we're going to go a little later about how to get a better focus, but you want to know who your customer is, because that's going to help you on the next point on how to intercept them, how to ultimately get others to help drive more business to you indirectly. But if you know your customer, you know their demographics or psychographics, you walk in their shoes, you know what they're consuming, where they're going to get advice, what activities they're doing, then you'll be able to map out and know the journey they go on and understand, well, where maybe you fit, where maybe the conversations that they're having that ultimately lead to the conversations that you have answers to, that you can ultimately be a part of. And so you then want to intercept them wherever possible. I'll bring up a good example here. This was when I used to work at Intuit, and I used to be part of the Mac side. We used to have QuickBooks Pro advisors go into Apple stores. And where it worked really well were those pro advisors that focused on the creatives, the creative industry. And again, remember, this is over a decade ago. They were able to work with the business consultants in the Apple store, because there's always one business consultant. So when a small business and a design agency would come into the Apple store looking for machines, they would then go to the business consultant, talk about machines, purchase the machines. But then the next question was, well, for these machines, I need to use particular software to help me run them. And so the business consultant would then have to, try to offer up different solutions. Now, the pro advisor that would be sitting, that would maybe be working with that business consultant would be directed those clients that came in, because they don't have the accounting answers. And that particular person needs someone to rely on to be able to hand that person off to. And so that relationship was mutually beneficial and ultimately led to some great referrals, but ultimately was an unanticipated a source of referrals and leads, because those folks understood where their clients are at, where they were shopping, what their behavior was, and they intercepted them along that path. Now, that doesn't mean you go, if you're focusing on manufacturing clients, or so let's say construction clients, that you're going to go down to Home Depot and befriend the cashiers. No, but you need to think about it logically about, well, where do they go? What do they do? And is there a way that I can be a part of it? And so again, by knowing your customer, you're able to figure out where do you get the best return of investment on your time and on your money in order to ultimately get those new clients through the door. So that's number 10. Let's move to number 9, technology. And technology came up over and over again in terms of, there's a lot of applications on there. The technology is rapidly changing. It's just accelerating. How do I stay across them? How do I know which ones are the best ones for not only my clients, but what are the best ones I use for my practice? And, time and time again, those who were quite successful in being able to navigate it and understand it, they were reaching out to their peers to see who had tested what to get some idea. There are those of you out there in the audience that are early adopters that love to tinker and love to play, and that's just a passion of yours. but you also have a passion to share. And so that goes back to, if you're not one that feels comfortable on going out and treading a new path and so forth, you reach out to your peers. And again, the roundtables were a good example where we would have conversations just around that table about, well, what do you use? Which applications are best? Which ones have you looked at? What's the good, the bad, and the ugly? But there's other places to go. You can go to the different forums that are on LinkedIn. You can go go on the QuickBooks Pro Advisor program and ask questions there. Again, there's different conferences. There's plenty of different avenues that you can reach out to. There's local meetups in your area. You just need to seek out those, because when you talk to your peers and you ask them, they'll give you the true answers of what. And again, you want to ask why. You want to understand, well, why did it work for you? And ask those multiple series of why questions to get to the root benefits and the root causes, and also the watchouts, so you know that which ones are right for you. We see that those who are doing really well and efficient are generally using, for their own apps, they're usually only using about 3 to 6 key apps to serve clients. The more and more apps that you bring in, the more and more complexity that you take on, the more and more context switching you have to have, the more user interfaces you have to learn, the more data is now going to be scattered across and have to be either aggregated together or manually rekeyed. Now, we've seen practices that had dozens, and we've seen few, but a few that had just a couple apps. But we are in a new day and age where, from a technology vendor perspective, it's focusing on purely what you can deliver and then integrating it with other products. And so it is now in the day and the age where you are going to have a set of applications to actually be able to serve clients and to be able to get done what you want in your own practice. So my advice there, and what we saw on the road, was, again, stick to 3 to 6, stick to the key core ones. And then it's not that these apps might not change over time. They will. You will find better apps along the way that you'll replace. Again, that's up to the technology vendors to do their best bet to ultimately keep them fresh and right. But again, keep the full set down to a smaller set. Eat your own dog food. A lot of folks that were playing with apps, they would play with them for 30 days and they'd use their own data and they'd use the trial periods for these particular applications and understand whether or not, who's it right for, what are the things that are changed from what I'm used to, which clients are they going to work for, what workflows, which ones they're not. And so, using your own data gives you, you don't have to worry about the context. You know your data, or you should know your data inside and out. And so you don't have to worry about that. And you don't take on the risk of actually having a client having a poor experience, or maybe you're having to do impromptu customer support on something you just don't understand. So you definitely want to play with it on your own, get a good comfort level, and ultimately then be able to roll something out. We did get a bunch of people who said they reach out directly to the technology vendors themselves. I think it's a good idea. If the technology vendor is not going to be responsive and answer your questions or be able to have the time to talk to you, then it may give you an insight in terms of how you may be supported at the end of the day, or you may not understand where they're ultimately where they're going to be driving their product direction, and it may not be where you want to go. So again, definitely have those conversations. So let's move to number 8. Number 8 was growth of business, and it was a bit of a few things brought together. And growth of business can be a generic, it's pretty much a generic statement here, but where it came from and where the sentiment is I want to be able to grow my business right. I want to know, how do I get to the next step? How do I continue, let's say I'm growing at X percent. How do I continue that X percent? What's it going to take? How do I ultimately be able to capture those economies of scale? How do I further, make this, these processes be replicable, and how do I ultimately get it to be able to function at a continual and proper growth trajectory? And the 3 things that came up here that were addressed, the first one actually was something that Ron Baker's been on the road. We saw him a couple of months back, but also some of the folks had subscribed to this concept as well, and it, again, it's quite smart, which was, you want to manage your capacity as a firm like an airliner. And what that means is inside of an airline or inside of a plane, you'll have economy, you'll have economy plus, you may have some other categories, you may have business class and first class. Now, if a first-class person, let's say it's one of your premier members, they're one of the top flyers that you have, and they show up to the airport and they show up to the counter, you can't turn them away. You got to find them a seat. And so you can incentivize other people to get off the plane, which a lot of us have seen, but you have extra capacity by which you could place them in first class or business class. So that's why you've always got that, we've got extra seats in business class. You put your name on the wait list and get on. And that's because there's a little bit of wiggle room that you need to have in order to make sure that your best customers can have a seat. And so the same thing has to happen in your own business where, you got to have that capacity. If you get a rock star client, a prospect that comes in that's going to be it's going to be one of your best clients, you need to make room for them. If you're constantly in the weeds, just trying to get the work done and not having that space or that time to be able to find and be able to bring in those good clients, then you're stuck. You're in a rut. You can't get out of it. And so the second item helps address that. But ultimately, what you need to do is with that extra capacity, it could be finding new clients. It could be absorbing a new client when it comes. It could be taking that step back and strategically looking at the business. It could be designing the processes that are going to make the business run more effectively. But when you're completely tapped out and maxed out on your projects, you don't do the other work that's ultimately going to allow you to have the business grow. You're just going to cycle at where you're at. So the second one is bad clients get referred elsewhere. And I put in quotes the referred because that's how it kept coming up. In other words, fire clients is another way some folks will say that. But, it's the standard sort of Pareto rule. And we saw it time and time again, which is, you'll have 20% of your clients taking up 80% of your time. And so you need to free yourself up from those people that are dragging your business down. And it's hard, yes, but find them a home somewhere else. It's a tough conversation, but it needs to be had. It's interesting. This was actually used as a motivation tool for teams. And there was a couple instances where we saw where people, where managers had said, look, we're going to trim off 10, 20% of our base every year, but everybody in the firm gets to fire one client. And the stories around that were just hilarious, where people would have names on papers and they would wait for the company meeting at the end of the year so they could get off their, they could put that paper forward and get that person off the rolls. And so people were just ecstatic, and it made the company party pretty exciting, I guess. But it's very interesting because, again, it's a relief, and it frees you up, it frees your mind, and it lets you ultimately be able to service other people better. So again, that's one way to get to capacity. The next point that kept coming up was you need to run it as a business. Those who were doing really well, they were talking about the fact that they may not have had dedicated resources. They may have just had dedicated time, but they had focus on sales. They had focus on marketing, content generation, customer service, the different functions that your small businesses that you work with would have in order for themselves to run a business. You need to run your business like theirs. You need to have those different departments, so to say. And again, those that were bigger were having dedicated people. They would have a dedicated account manager. They would have a dedicated marketer. They would have a dedicated onboarder that were onboarding clients. And there's different ways you can structure your firm. I get it. You can have horizontal or vertical firms where, you may have like a virtual CFO that does everything for a client, or you may have departments like in accounting and bookkeeping and so forth. But in the absence of that, in the absence of resources, you can definitely dedicate a certain amount of time per week to do all the different functions that are required for that business to function and function well. And so you need to step back and think of it as not just the projects you're doing for client, but I'm running a business. I need to function like that as well. So that was number 8 on the charts of growth of business. Number 7, a little bit of segue from the last one, onboarding of new clients. It's interesting. We went around the table and we would ask how long it would take people to onboard clients. And on average, it took about a month and a half to 2 months to onboard clients for folks. And that's from the point of the start of we're going to work together to the point of the work being routine. And so again, that is not just the collection of some information. But we had some folks that were doing it within a week, time and time again. So when we pressed people on what they were doing there and how they were making it happen, the first one is something we actually saw in research as well, which was when you give somebody a questionnaire and and or you give them the folder of this is what I need from you, and it's 50 pages long and nothing's been filled out, you get a blank look back, and you ultimately get a an organizer that's not filled out or never done. And that's just because it's too daunting from a small business owner, or from an individual that's doing a tax return, for an example. This is stuff they're not familiar with. This is why they came to a professional. They want help, and you just can't push back. I just need all this stuff. They don't know what a FEIN is. They probably don't know their tax ID. They don't know all the particulars. So you want to progressively ask. You don't want to ask for the whole thing. You want to ask for the critical things you need at each point in time, and build up confidence as you go, so that they can continue to go out and do those things and not feel like there's this massive wall in front of them that they've got to overcome. The next thing there is validate when possible. It's easy for, if you give somebody something to work from, they can use the pattern to maybe think about where they had it. So again, if you think of like a tax ID number or whatnot, by looking at one that's a sample or looking at one that may be theirs, they'll recognize and say, yeah, I've seen that number before. I don't know if that one's right, but I remember it being on this document. And so I can go look there and see whether or not that's right. But it gives them a starting point. And so wherever possible, don't have people fill out information that you may already have, or at least try to fill it out for them in some way and have them validate whether it's correct, because again, it helps them go through it faster. The second one that was really important that people brought up was clear responsibilities for both parties. And so this is at the conversation even before you close the sale, but it's the conversation, when you are going to move forward to work together. It's here's what you're responsible for doing, and this is what I'm responsible for doing. And we're a partnership to do this. Had a woman in Chicago that brought this up, and she said, look, if you're going to take on reconciliation, if you're going to take on invoicing or AP, whatever it might be, look, that means I'm not doing it, but that means you're an extension of my team. And because of that, I have my own team, I have my own set of criteria that you've got to meet in order for us to effectively and efficiently meet the agreed upon goals that we have. We want to get you to where you want to be, but you've got to be a team member in getting that done. And so then she'd lay out, well, here's the responsibilities that you've got to meet in order to be a de facto person on my team and me being a de facto person on your team. And so if they didn't meet that, then they ultimately are going to relieve themselves of those responsibilities, and that will be owned back, and then obviously it'd be repriced and the like. This also helps in terms of clear expectations, and the ability to work through things together. And so again, sending it all up front really starts for a really good trusting relationship. I would like to point out that in that as well, a lot of people would say that, that first, when we decide that we're going to work together, we immediately schedule the onboarding meeting, that first onboarding meeting, and we give them the set of things that we want them to go get and be ready to talk about. We know they won't bring it in that first meeting, but it sets the path and it sets the tone, and it keeps us moving versus they leave and we do this calendar, this emailing back and forth to just get on the calendar and follow up and everything else. No, take care of it when you can take care of it and create that path. The next and the last piece we'll talk about here is really building confidence, and that's and trust, and that's really via training. We'll talk a little bit about on handoffs as well. But if you're going to give someone clear responsibilities, you need to be able to set them up for success. And again, it's confusing. It may seem simple to you, but it may not be simple to the client. Again, just how are we going to exchange documents? If you want me to send you my 1120, okay, well that's fine. But how do I send it to you? It may just be showing on a computer. Go, look, this is the document repository that we use. This is how we'd like you to pass. Here's like how we would like you to do your passwords. And take them through one exercise of that, because once you do that, now they get it, now they remember, now they feel like they can own it. And so training is really important in terms of setting those people up to understand and be able to handle the responsibilities that come. Handoffs are another one. Again, we talked about on the previous one on having maybe dedicated team members. So let's say I have a dedicated account manager, I've got an onboarding, and then I've got the ongoing client manager. Well, that's going through multiple bodies. And so you want to have meetings where both people are together. It's explained, what the next step is, why those people are there, what they're going to do, and how the journey is going to go. And so being able to make sure that the client is passed smoothly from phase to phase is really important to make sure they go smoothly through onboarding and into a really healthy set of projects and client relationship on the back end. So let's move to number 6. Number 6, value pricing and bundling. Big topic here. A lot of discussion recently about it. In fact, we're actually the webinar you're viewing today is actually a precursor to, we're doing a value pricing series webinar in February. So you can go check that out at Firm of the Future. But value pricing and bundling, when we talk to a lot of folks, it's just around the strategy. It's understanding how to set this up and the fear of getting going, and then how do I improve upon what I have. And so a few things come up. One is, a lot of folks were sharing information at the table. And this goes back down to, just like in technology, learn from your peers, look at people's websites, talk to folks in the industry, because they'll share you the good, the bad, and the ugly, and what to stay away from. The first one that came up here is the power of threes work. When you serve up somebody three options, there's a good, better, best. They're gonna gravitate towards the middle, and so it helps you in terms of steering people to a higher engagement. Again, note that the better that the more they're working with you, the better off they're probably going to be, because they're not financial management experts, they're not accountants. They need one in their corner. They need that trusted advisor. And so, being able to do the bundling, and we'll talk about later about how to be able to create the bundles in the future webinars. But creating those three bundles really helps steer the conversation. But also, you need to set the prices. And again, most people don't do value pricing; they're doing fixed fees. And even with that, you need to know, what is the base price that I can take any package for and not lose my shirt? Right? What is the minimum I'm willing to take to actually be able to nut out a living on this? But then you want to look at the other side. Well, what is the highest price that someone might be willing to pay? When am I going to be getting, when am I going to be saying Yahoo when a couple people are going to take that price point? And then in between that, whether it's the average or whether it's a little bit below or above, that's your expected price. And that's the one you typically are going to serve up. So each one of those packages has those three price points. And that's how you're able to gauge from the conversation that you're going to have about, which one they're going to want to consume. The second one there is the value conversation. Folks mention, this is probably the most important piece. When somebody comes in and they would tell you, I just need some tax work done. Well, what is the ultimate goal they're trying to solve? Why were they seeking help? What was the background by which they came to this conclusion? The value conversation is really important to understand, well, what is the root cause for what they perceive as what they need? And this is sitting back and letting the small business owner or letting the individual talk about their experiences, about what they're looking for, what their goals are. Again, remember, everyone wants to talk about their passion. And again, from a small business, their passion is their business. And so there's no shortage of conversation that you just have to keep probing. And that's where you use maybe the 5 whys. You ask somebody, well, why did you do this? Okay, well, why did you do that? Why'd you do this? If you ask why 5 times in that conversation, you will get to the root cause. And you ultimately want them talking, so that way you can articulate, well, I understand what your struggles are. I understand what your goals are. This is how me and my firm, this is what we do. This is how we can get you there. And this is how, what it looks like to come on with us. And this is ultimately the package you should choose, and the services that'll get you there. Let's get you going. And it changes the whole dynamic of the conversation. And so the most important piece of this is really that value conversation. The last one that people bring up with was, there was a big nervousness around, and it's fair. It's, how do I know how much, I left money on the table, or did I ultimately, deliver a ton of work and not get properly paid for it? And I'm not necessarily, making money on this. And so these after action reviews and iteration exercises, where once you're done with a particular project, once you've gone end to end, is to look back and see, well, what could I have done differently here to change the outcome? What are the things I've learned along the way, so that I can change what I'm doing going forward with future clients or future projects, to ultimately be able to get the best value and give the best service to the client that comes through the door. And so that looking back was so critical in terms of fine tuning. And everyone, the folks we talked to that were extremely proficient said it's a constant learning experience. It's a constant iteration. So you just set your expectations around that. Okay, so let's go to number 5, standardized processes. And when folks were talking about this, oh yeah, I know I need to get standardized processes if they didn't have it, or I've got something, or folks would say, yeah, we've got some, but it's not necessarily followed. Or folks who did do it, they talked about the fact of, again, just like value pricing, it's a journey and it's an iteration, and you keep iterating on it. So one of the things that came across here was that the concept that everyone has ownership, and this is going to apply to a couple of this point and the next one in terms of the number 4 on the list. But everyone needs to be an owner inside of the practice. And I said DMP model. What I mean by that is, I referenced this earlier, there's people who do the work, there's people who manage the work, and there's partners and owners that oversee the work. And again, you could be wearing multiple hats or just one of those. But everyone needs to know what they own. A doer might own the project and the client. A manager might own the team and the outcomes. The partner and the owner will own the outcomes of the firm overall. But if everybody knows what everyone's solving for and how it all ladders up together, it creates a sense of it creates trust, transparency, and ultimately allows for processes to take hold because everybody knows how everyone's working together to achieve the outcomes. And so, again, the goals that should be set should be 3 months, 6 months max in terms of where we're trying to get to. Everyone's held accountable, and then everyone owns a piece of that along the chain. And that goes then to the second one, which was, with standardized processes, you got to be able to, they can't be rigid. They've got to have flexibility. In terms of those who are creating the processes, that's definitely done by those who are doing it. They're the most familiar. They're the ones facing the clients. They're the ones dealing with it day in and day out. And so they own actually the creation of the process, while the managers own the collapse or the aggregation that across people in order to bring those processes into one standard. But once those standards are created, the standardized processes are created and approved by the partners per se, they're generally loaded into checklists. Now, each client, as we talk to folks, they kept mentioning, well, each client's just slightly different. And so while my processes are standard, I have to tweak them just a little bit to make it so each client's going to work correctly. And that flexibility is owned by those who are working closely with the clients. And they're linking it back to the detail of how the process should be done, because that's how you get your economies to scale, is that it's repeatable. So in case somebody else comes in, they can follow the same way it's being delivered. But again, the checklists themselves and how I'm ticking through the work, you have to allow for that flexibility to exist. Otherwise, it becomes too onerous. It's not going to work for certain clients, and you're going to get pushback from people who are trying to get it done. The next one is periodic reviews, continuous improvement, just like value pricing. Before, it was usually I would hear about a year was pretty good. The reality now is those who are doing it said it's constant and living documents. If there's a problem, they change it. The ones who are doing it the best, those who were doing it pretty good, they were tweaking their processes once every 3 months, and they were reevaluating them every 6 months. And again, if you really want to get to that growth of business on number 8, it's about how do you continue to have great processes that provide great quality of service that are repeatable, that allow you to get through it faster and faster. Because when a value pricing model, that's how you're ultimately able to get higher profitability. Okay, so that's 5. We're going to go to 4, practice management, which can be a pretty broad category overall. And this is, if you're curious, this is where I'll show you a little later, or talk about a little later. But carbon sits within this realm as well. But the problems that people came up with is, I've got these different silos of information. I want them together. The biggest one that came up was email. I'm working with my clients on email back and forth, and I have a document repository over here. I'm doing tax here. I've got I've got QuickBooks over here that I'm running, and then maybe if lucky, I have a workflow solution that I'm trying to manage the checklist together. And so those who were doing well were eliminating all those info silos. They were bringing them together with it could be technology, but it could also be in processes. One of the ones that kept coming up time and time again is team collaboration tools. Again, there's horizontal tools out there like Slack. Slack came up a lot. If you want a verticalized tool, again, that's where like a Carbon would be there. But the whole point of these is if you're using a team collaboration tool, folks were quoting 30 to 50% reduction in email. And that's because email drives, it drives conversation doesn't need to happen. If I send you a thank you, you're going to send me a thank you back. If we're going to try to schedule a meeting, we'll probably go through 5-6 emails back and forth to finally get to a time. Team collaboration tools, they use process of instant messaging, but they also have the searchable. They've got channels by which you can then have context. All of that allows you to speed up how you're able to get things done and work together. And so again, email, again, the larger the team, the more and more you're starting to have information siloed on those emails. And again, the team collaboration tools are pretty key. The next one is everyone's on task to track everything. If you're using standardized processes, if you want to bring it all together into something that you're going to use to manage the firm, everyone from the top to the bottom has to be on task to track everything. You get one squeaky wheel, you get one person who decides not to do it, the whole thing starts to collapse on itself. And that's because everyone's in it together. And when things are missing, then people will be using other things to track. And ultimately, now you've got those silos popping back up again, and you don't have that visibility you need to be able to see across the work, across the client relationship, and so forth. And so those who are doing it really well, not only we're having people where every task, every checklist item, every project had one owner. Doesn't mean that in a checklist that there was one owner across every item in that, but every task within that would have one owner. And that's because you can have multiple people following, but one person's was on the line to make sure it was getting done. And so that leads to then that trust and transparency on the last bullet there, which is transparency is a two-way street. Communications is critical in a firm. If you're able to talk about where the firm is going at a high level, if you're a partner, and communicate that across the firm and be able to have that open dialogue, then the dialogue is going to be open coming back in terms of here's where the projects stand, here's where we're at, here's how we're addressing it. But again, if that dialogue isn't healthy and that culture isn't going to foster that, then you're not going to have the transparency and visibility that practice management is going to deliver. And so you need to be thoughtful about and have the culture and show the behavior that you want to have emulated in the firm. Number 3, marketing. So this is an extension of number 10 and number 8. We talked about it a little bit. The big key takeaway here, and I know you've heard this in a lot of webinars and a lot of talks, but specialize. Find your niche. The reason for this is number 2, it really focuses your efforts. It really provides you the best value of your time and resources. And so having a directed focus, understanding, this goes back to know your customer. It's easier to know your customer when they're one type. If it's everybody, then it's very hard to identify your customers and know where to go to bridge the gap. But specialize, it doesn't have to be an industry, though that's the easiest one. It could be the company size or the space, where they are in their journey, the life cycle journey. Are they trying to get to match? They're mature. Are they early stage startups? I don't know. Are they a particular revenue size? Again, are they in a vertical? Are they using a specific solution? I don't know, but again, this is where you look back and at your base and figure out, well, what sort of, when I look at the clients, which ones do I seem to gravitate towards? What do I have a bulk of? The next piece of that is understand which ones do I have passion around? Because if you don't have passion, it shows in the work. So maybe your bulkiest section of your business is not where you're passionate at. Maybe your passion's at a smaller section, and maybe that's where you focus. But again, specialize. And that goes to focusing your efforts on marketing. It can be expensive. It can also be time consuming. We would hear people talk about, well, I want to have a content strategy. I want to have social marketing. Well, you got to have a huge social base to do general, broad social marketing. But if you have a focus and a niche and a specialization, you can generate content that's very unique for the audience that you're trying to attract. And now you're not competing with all these big name players or big people and personalities who are talking about just generalized topics. You're a subject matter expert, and you're able to then articulate that content and have, you have the credibility, and you'll have also the findability, because the search terms will come up more easily for you when people are looking for that type of content. But again, focusing your efforts helps when you're knowing your customer in terms of certain marketing vehicles. Is my customer really going to respond to newsletters? Are they going to go to local events that I might drive? Are they going to go to advertising that I might do on Facebook? I don't know. You have to look at your client on which ones they're going to have the highest propensity to use or to look at or to absorb or to consume. And so this is where focusing your effort will ultimately get you the best return on investment, and that comes from the specialization. The last one was consistency across all assets. It's that sense of professionalism. It's it's the perception of what you're able to do. And so those that were doing well had Facebook, LinkedIn, Twitter profiles, their website, all had a similar look and feel and advocated and spoke to the same message. And that, again, is reassuring and it's validating when somebody's looking for someone to support them. Before they pick up the phone, they're going to look at the website. They're going to look at what the ratings and reviews are online. They're going to look at some of those social aspects. And so if you're having that consistency across, then it's going to continually sing out to them and have them get motivated to pick up the phone to call or to send you an email, whatever it might be. And so having that consistency is really helpful. Okay, number 2, work-life time management. This is very individualistic, it turns out, as we spoke to folks. People operate in different ways, and different tips and tricks, may not apply to everybody. But it was definitely something that, this particular topic came up time and time again. And, we gravitated to these 3. I'll give them maybe 1 or 2 more. But the first one was people had to take time to reflect on what was important to them. What about with the work-life balance? What about the time, were they poorly managing it? Where was it happening? You got to step back and look at things holistically and understand where are things not where I want them to be. Until you do that, you don't have a good sense of where you want to go, and it's harder and harder for you to drive that change. The next one that people brought up continually was determine the critical few. What are the things that are really important to you? And that usually comes out of that time to reflect. But what are the things that are really important for you personally? What are the critical things that are important to the business? Which are my top clients? What are my top services? Who are my key staff? What are the things that are ultimately need to be aligned in order for you to be efficient or to free up time? And make sure you focus on that. That goes back to that 80-20 Pareto rule, Pareto effect rule I was talking about before. But what are the critical things that need to be done? And then with that, prioritize. Prioritization is a daily, if not, constant activity. Don't just, everyone across the board needs to be thinking about, well, what is the best use of my time to drive to the outcomes of the firm overall and to the goals that I have set? And am I working on those things that are driving the best value? And so that has both a personal side of it and a work side of it. You have to be maniacal about making sure you're focusing on the critical few, but prioritizing them to the top to get them done. The last one I'll give out there is just a little tidbit that came up, was around the phone. The phone is a massive distraction. It really disrupts things. It's part of the problem of the modern age. Those who seem to have better work-life time management, they would come into their house and they would put their phone and leave it somewhere. They'd put it in a bowl, they'd turn it face down, and they'd walk away from it. And that was liberating because they weren't distracted by it, and they weren't focused on it. Folks tell us, don't leave your phone next to your bed with it face up, because when the light comes on, it immediately brings back that anxiety of work. So be very careful with the phone. Those who were doing well had processes around that. The next one was beyond the phone. In terms of your work-life time management, ultimately was in terms of being able to manage your day and understanding what's important to you, is really being able to keep yourself at task with what those things are and listing them out and having something to follow on a day-to-day basis. So people were using to-do tools and things like that. There's some out there, but just understanding where they're headed and why they're headed there. Okay, the last point. Number 1, topping the charts, talent acquisition. By far, talent acquisition was the number 1 barrier. It doesn't matter if you're small or you're large. Everyone's struggling to find talent and finding the right talent. Attracting them, less on retaining, but more on attracting them. And it really comes down to in terms of overall, those who are coming into industry, it's growing only about 1% in terms of the talent side of things, while small businesses are growing at a much higher rate. And so there's plenty of work out there, but there's just not enough people to do it. The mantra that came up at the top is a huge one, and I heard this, I think this one was in Chicago actually, was you hire for attitude, you train for skill, and you fire for example. And where that came from was, there was people who were expressing that they would go out and find the perfect resume. The person met all the criteria. It was like the unicorn of talent that they wanted for the role that they had. But then the person came in, and while they said they had on paper everything they needed, they just couldn't work within the environment that was given. They just couldn't work with the team. They couldn't work with the clients. There was something about it with the attitude that just didn't make it work. And then it became much more painful inside the firm versus becoming something that was supposed to alleviate the pain. And so it was time and time again, we would hear people say, look, I'd rather hire for someone who's got the right attitude, that's got the right, you know, runway to ramp, ultimately has the spirit and the drive. I can train them what to do, or they can learn what they need to do. I'll give them the freedom to do that. But I cannot teach attitude. I can teach the skills. And so it was better to go down the route of making sure you had the attitude and the cultural fit right than it was to have the quintessential best skills. The fire, for example, is once you get a bad seat, got to get rid of them. Got to get rid of them as fast as you can, because it will ultimately just take down the organization. And so that helps set the tone for, and it helps people feel confident in leadership that, I don't like that guy. That guy didn't do a great job, and that person's out. Now, the hires came down two routes. There's millennials and there's senior hires. Let's just talk about millennials. The interesting thing about millennials were the language came up time and time again. Job postings and so forth, you have to use the word you in the job postings. You have to talk about your culture and why you're different. You have to explain how working with you will ultimately drive to a career path that they're imagining that they want to be in. And so those job postings and so forth were critical. Folks were, one thing that came up was people were using a company called Accounting Fly to serve up new hire or serve folks that are leaving from college. People had forged relationships with local community colleges and universities with the faculty that were, that were teaching accounting courses and the like, because that helped them identify people to do internships or for recent hires. Once people had internships or they had recent hires come from university, those people who were part of the business would feed back to future classes, and so there was this sort of inertia that it created. On millennials and job postings overall, there was a whole dialogue on Craigslist. I know some of you just roll your eyes when you hear that, but there were some pretty interesting tips and tricks around Craigslist. If you were to get 100 resumes from Craigslist, guaranteed 95 are complete garbage. But there might be one diamond in the rough there. And so what people would do is they'd make a Craigslist ad and put in the post up there. They would then say in the ad, you have to reply back to me with this subject line, and I want you to answer this question in the body. And what they would then do is they would set up an email filter that would filter on the subject line, and that would move all the people who did what they were supposed to do into one folder. So now they can just look at the 5 that actually did what they were told versus the 95 that didn't. And then they would look for how the answer was crafted in the email to then identify whether or not they'd follow up with that 1 or 2. So interesting thing there. On the senior hire side, people were really using LinkedIn and a lot of virtual hires. We saw firms that had stay-at-home moms and fathers that were a part of the firm. Those that were returning to the workforce, returning parents. There was also, retiring CFOs, comptrollers, and the like that were looking to be able to continue their career, but again, do it in a little bit different terms. What's interesting is once somebody was able to penetrate into that, where they were to get that partner, that mom returning to the workforce, they would then go and have that, get posting placed into the parents groups or to these LinkedIn groups about anybody else that they would refer or recommend that would be looking. And it took on a life of its own. There was a couple practices in the Southeast and one in the Northwest that, again, they got all of their great hires and were able to build out their team just because of that. And so it's not necessarily about the LinkedIn, making a job posting in LinkedIn, but going out to your network and saying, this is who I'm looking for, does anybody know? And having that be passed around so that you get folks who are already vetted, you can ultimately get the cream of the crop from. Definitely a lot more in this. In the firm of the future, later in the year, we're going to provide a lot more content around that. So more to come on that. So that's the top 10. Let's go through the summary and key takeaways. So again, there's that chart again. What I've put up here is there was the top 10. I threw in a few more: strategic planning, tracking communication, visibility, managing deadlines, staff compensation. Those are the next 5. There's a long laundry list after that. But again, that's how we were able to aggregate them all into those 7 different buckets that we have. And so hopefully that starts to make a whole lot more sense. So what are the key takeaways? Going back to those 7 categories that I mentioned, the first thing is understand you are not alone. When you look at those particular barriers, time and time again, we would find, those top 10 were always, we would be addressing in those top 10 at least 2 of those in every session. And there may be a third one that was in it, or maybe something that was different and unique. But they're not uncommon problems, which means it's great, because that means a lot of other people are out there and you can work together in order to solve them. And a lot of people have solved them. So again, we've given you some tips and tricks here today. First one on the practice management, I can't reinforce enough. Again, I'm putting what I've put up here where the big ones, the big takeaways, is rise above your inbox, your email. Got to get above email. One of those ways to do that is through team collaboration tools. Go look at those. It'll take a good amount of that email out, but you need to make sure you can action those emails and put them in context for the team to be able to leverage. On the HR side, that mantra, hire for attitude, train for skills, fire for example, definitely take that away. Again, attitude is everything in terms of getting people, ultimately to work well on the team. On the strategy, you got to find your niche. We talked about this already. Go out there, try to figure out what's right for you and right for your firm, and then use that to ultimately get better economies of scale on your resources. Pricing for value. We're going to be talking about that all next month. So again, we're going to go into that in a lot more detail, but that's a big strategy in terms of being able to free yourself up from the billable hour. Time management, again, it's really about focusing on the critical few and prioritize. Client acquisition, the 2 words there, referral marketing. Just focus on that. And that'll give you the best outcome. Processes and tools, just figure out what your core 3 to 6 apps are. And then, be able to build your practice around that with the processes. And sales and marketing, know your customer. If you know your customer, you'll be able to contain your costs and you'll be much more successful in closing prospects into clients. And so that knowledge and being able to talk to them is super critical. And on the last one is Intuit's Firm of the Future is here to help. So Intuit's is putting together a lot of content. I think again you'll be able to, again, not only in February as we go through the value pricing series where we're going to be talking about the 10 steps of value pricing. It's a live webinar. It's going to be on February 9th. But there will also be a recorded webinar on what the journey is and what to expect when moving to value pricing, plus a bunch of articles up there as well. And so the team over at Intuit, they're working hard to really put up a lot of great and meaningful content. So you should check out firmofthefuture.com to get more and more details. And so, again, if you want to learn more, go down there to firmofthefuture.com to continue your journey. There's going to be a wealth of information. Again, there's these webinar series that are going forward every month. So you get a new topic of the month, plus a whole lot of other great content to capture. We have come to the end of the talk. From myself, from the Carbon team, from the Intuit team, thank you. My email is up there if you have any questions on the contents that's there. It's my cell phone as well. Don't call me late at night. If you want to learn more about Carbon, just go to carbonhq.com. Again, thank you so much, and we'll catch you in February.